he is good. For he is good. Give thanks to the Lord. For he is good. For he is good. Give thanks to the Lord. For he is good. For he is good. His love endures forever.
His love will reign
forevermore.
His power will reign
forevermore.
His grace will reign
forevermore.
His peace will reign
forevermore.
His love will reign
forevermore.
His power will reign
forevermore.
His
love endures forever.
Good morning to you all. I suppose Happy Father's Day is in order for all those who've been fathers a number of times. You have one child or one on the way, perhaps. We'll include you in that number. So Happy Father's Day to you as well. And today we have opportunity to worship our own Father that we all share in common. Right, so we're going to take up from Ezekiel 17. And as usual, I'll do my customary recap on how far we've gone and to lead us to this point. That was the context of Ezekiel, and the chapters that we're dealing with at the moment are occurring kind of like 2 or 3 years before the actual siege of Jerusalem is going to begin, and that siege in itself will be about 30 months long. And so this is now the lead up to that, and Ezekiel is getting visions from time to time as this actual time, historical time, future historical time approaches. All right, so we're in this section here, chapters 12 to 19. We're still looking at the certainty and the comprehensiveness of judgment, and that's what we're going to be dealing with. Just a bit of a recap. I think we'll go through. I'll work the recap in as we go through the verses. If you think of all the ways in which God has attempted to communicate his message that calls for repentance from his people, the various mediums that he has used up until this point to try and reach his people, it kind of like is starting to get towards a climax. He's starting to use more and more mediums of communication, and we'll get into what a medium of communication is, but he's starting to use more of them to try. I wouldn't call it desperation. God doesn't get desperate, but he's using more and more creative methods in which to try and reach his people, because they don't seem to be listening, and he describes them as people that are stubborn, full of pride, and those are the problems he's coming up against. So let's have a look here at verses 1 and 2. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, ask a riddle and present a parable to the house of Israel. All right. If we have a look at the various mediums that God has used in the past, the first 3 chapters were a vision that God gave, a complicated vision. I remember I did those chapters, and that was God trying to communicate what was going to happen to Jerusalem. And of course, Daniel was the one to recount this or put it into words so that he could tell the people about this vision that he had. And we also had a look at what I call chapters 4 and 5 was kind of like a reenactment, or rather a pre-enactment, where Ezekiel was to kind of like pre-enact by means of using bricks and clay and all that to try and pre-enact what is going to happen to Jerusalem when it's besieged by King Nebuchadnezzar. And so he went through that. I think that took almost a year to do. And I suppose when the people saw him doing this, lying on his side for weeks on end, to try and pre-enact this, they might have thought he was a bit crazy. So maybe that method didn't work as well, using this pre-enactment. It didn't seem to have an effect on the people. They didn't repent. And as we look at the techniques that he used later on, we have a look at chapter 15 that talks about, it's kind of like an allegory that was used that compared Israel to a useless vine. And what's going to happen to that vine? It's going to get pruned, it's going to get cut off. Chapter 16 that Brother Rob did last month, it kind of like, and I suppose one way to summarize that particular verse is the very last verse in that particular chapter of 16. It says, in order that you may remember and be ashamed and never open your mouth anymore because of your humiliation, when I have forgiven you for all that you have done, the Lord declares. So it's kind of like after all this heavy judgment that God is passing on and warnings that God is passing on to Israel through Ezekiel, it's kind of like there's this idea of forgiveness that's going to be there. And so we're introduced to that in chapter 16. Now we're going to have a look in chapter 17 where a new tactic is being used to try and communicate the message that God wants to get to his people, a message of repentance. Now the words they use in here are riddle and, the word is parable translated here, but it's more like a proverb. So the first word is chideh. And that you can find in Judges chapter 14, and translating it a riddle is probably as good as you can get that translation. And that is in reference to the riddles that Samson had and gave Delilah in order that he could try and guess his secret. He had those 3 riddles that he gave him. So that's what this word means. It's giving something a hidden meaning, if you like, a little saying, a short saying that has a very hidden meaning that you're supposed to solve. Then if you have a look at the next word used here is mashal. And this is in reference to kind of like a proverb. They use this word a lot in reference to the Proverbs of Solomon. This word is used there. So what do you get when you combine a riddle with a kind of like a story, if you like, or narrative? If you combine those two, what do you get? You get a parable. Of course, we all know what parables are. If we've read the New Testament, one of the most favorite mediums of communication that Jesus used when he was trying to reach the people, the Jewish people of his time, when he was doing his 3-year ministry. A parable was a very common method that he used. In fact, he rarely used any other medium to communicate to them. So here, God is trying this medium now to communicate to his people through a parable. All right. Let's have a look at... All right, so I've got a question for you guys. Maybe, if we think of all the methods that have been used to date, the medium that have been used to date, if you were to try and put yourself in the shoes of a Jewish person, an Israelite, what would have reached you? What would have made a connection with you? If you saw somebody lying down there on their side and reenacting like a crazy man, what's going to happen to Jerusalem, or somebody told you of this grand vision, what would solidify with you? Can be a rhetorical question, or somebody can put up their hand and answer it. Parable, yes. Parable is a very effective means of communication because it has a story that people can relate to, and it has a meaning. Now, thankfully, when we're looking at this parable that we'll see in chapter 17, thank goodness, there is a translation. God provides a translation for this parable. And sometimes Jesus did this as well. He would tell people a parable and he would give them a translation. Sometimes he would tell them a parable and he'd leave it with them to see whether they can come up with that translation. Maybe he knew they would figure it out eventually, and thinking about it, going home, talking about it, they would think about that meaning. So here we have a very complicated, and I must admit, if there was no translation in the scriptures for this parable, I don't think many commentators would have actually worked out what it actually means. So that's probably why the meaning is accompanied with, and the answer to the parable is provided as well. All right, so we all agree parables are good. All right, Ezekiel chapter 17, verse 3. Saying, "This is what the Lord God says, a great eagle with great wings, long pinions, and a full plumage of many colors, came to Lebanon and took away the top of the cedar." Weird, but unusual. So now what we're going to do today is we're not only going to have a look at verse 3, but we're going to have a look at the interpretation of that as well, kind of like do them hand in hand. And we'll cover them kind of like at the same time. So the interpretation begins kind of like in verse 11. So we're going to jump verses, and we're going to have a look backwards and forwards and check what was said to what the meaning is of that. All right, so let's unpack this. So this great eagle is in reference to the Babylonian king. So that would be King Nebuchadnezzar. And we can read that in verse 12. It says this, "Say now to the rebellious house, do you not know that what these things mean? Say, behold, the king of Babylon came to Jerusalem, took its kings and princes, and brought them to him in Babylon." So yeah, we have that interpretation. And we know this is King Nebuchadnezzar because of what we read. And we'll have a look at references to that as well, because of what we read in the books of Kings and Chronicles that talk about the activity of Babylon, who was king, what they did, when they did it, and how long they did it for. All right, so that's the great eagle, Nebuchadnezzar. Then it talks there about his great wings. He had a kingdom that reached very far, very wide. If you think of the world powers that have gone throughout history, beginning with, I suppose, Egypt will be the first one, and then we talk about Assyria, the Assyrian kingdom that was responsible for taking the northern kingdom of Israel into exile. Now we have Babylon, and of course, after that, we're going to see the empire of the Persians and Medes. And then we're going to have a look at the Greeks, and then we're going to have a look at the Romans. And each time one of these kingdoms succeeded the other, and their reach got further and further. So at this point, when Babylon was the ruler of the world, they'd taken over all the territories, apart from Egypt, or some parts of Egypt. They'd taken over these territories that all the other kingdoms before had. So at this point in time, Babylon had spread the widest of any kingdom to date. So that's why it talks about the great wings, how far and wide their dominance spread throughout the world, the known world. It also talks there about long pinions. I don't know if you know what a pinion is. It's just it's the feathers on the end of the wings, right on the tip of the wings. They use them for gliding and doing micro adjustments in the air. These long, strong feathers right on the tips of the wings, and it would give your wingspan another 10 or 20 centimeters just on the feathers alone. So those are these pinions, and the wings are kind of like the same kind of concept that we're talking about in terms of how far the kingdom reached. Then it talks here about full plumage, many colors. It's very descriptive, and you'll notice there's another great eagle that we talk about later on that doesn't have that description. That's one way it differs from this eagle, is this, it didn't have this full plumage of many colors. And that's probably indicative of how Babylon reached a very diverse area, a very diverse set of cultures and countries. And so as a result, because of the way that it dominated the world, was very different to the Assyrians. The Assyrians would pretty much conquer it, burn it, flatten it. while as the Babylonians, they would not be so destructive. They would rather allow the people to continue with their cultures and their customs, allow them some kind of autonomy, and all they had to do was pay a tribute to Babylon every now and again. And that was the agreements that they would have. So as a result, it preserved all these wonderful colors, if you like, of all these different colorful nations and cultures. They were preserved, they weren't destroyed. And of course, they conquered them all in different ways. Different countries are not so agreeable when being conquered than others. Some will just submit straight away and done, get conquered in a matter of a week. While as others, like Jerusalem, for example, are very, very stubborn, and they would hold on for as long as possible. So different countries fall in different ways. Now it talks here about Lebanon. He came to Lebanon. So the idea is, and we see the translation here, it talks about coming to Jerusalem. Now, Lebanon is not Jerusalem, but a lot of things that were in Jerusalem came from Lebanon. So we're talking about the cedars of Lebanon, the fine wood that was gotten from the kind of like northern parts along the coastal side of the country. I don't have a map yet to show that. But a lot of that was imported to Jerusalem. The temple and Solomon's house was made, a lot of it was made of that material. So it had a very big influence in the construction of Jerusalem and Solomon's house. Have a look at 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 2. I've got a reference there. 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 2. And the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within tent curtains." That was a time period in which it was the preferred choice of the kings to build their houses of this kind of cedar, not only because it looked beautiful and was structurally sound, but it smelt very good as well. Cedar has got a very nice smell to it. And as you can see there, they weren't happy with the idea that they live in these lovely houses, but God's temple is sitting in a tent made of leather. And so they built the house of the Lord as well from those materials, and gold and silver and all that. So when they talk about the cedars of Lebanon, we're talking about Jerusalem. We're talking about the influence they had on Jerusalem. It says here, they took away the top of the cedar. All right, so at this time, the king that was ruling in Israel at the time was Jehoiachin. Now, Jehoiachin was, let's have a look. We got a reference there. 2 Kings chapter, this will give us a bit of a history on Jehoiakim. I think it's important to know the poor fellow that was king at the time when Babylon really got down to business. 2 Kings 24, 10 to 16. 2 Kings 24, 10 to 16. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, went up to Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. So this is now in reference to the first besieging of Jerusalem. It occurred on more than one occasion. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his captains and his officials. So the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. And he carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem and all the captains and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. So he led Jehoiakim away into exile to Babylon, also the king's mother and the king's wives and his officials, and the leading men of the land. He led them away into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. And all the men of valor, 7,000, and the craftsmen and the smiths, 1,000, all strong and fit for war. And these the king of Babylon brought into exile. And it goes on there to talk about how Babylon appointed Zedekiah as the ruler of Judah to carry on for that time onwards. They would have their own autonomy. They'd be able to still rule. They'd be able to keep their worship. They'd be able to keep their culture. And they would have that agreement that they would pay a treaty to the king of Babylon for a period of time, or every so often. Now, one thing you would also need to know, and I don't have the verse here, is Jehoiachin only ruled Judah for 3 months. And he was 18 years old. So we're talking about a very vulnerable country with a very vulnerable leader at that time. So he crumbled pretty quickly. It didn't take a long time before that siege was pretty short. May have been a few weeks long. That was it. All right, so that's here we're talking about this great eagle. We're talking about Babylon here. Let's have a look in verse 4. He broke off the topmost of its young twigs and brought it to a land of merchants. He set it in a city of traders. So we can compare this with verse 12 again, which we've read already. This topmost of its young twigs is in reference to not only the king at the time, Jehoiakim, but any of his family or those of nobility, if you like, they were taken. And that reference was in verse 15 that we read already in 2 Kings chapter 24. There we are. 24 verse 8 talks about how he was 18 years old, Jehoiachin, and not a nice way to start your reign as king, to come up against Nebuchadnezzar. And it talks about a land of merchants, just symbolizes Babylon. Babylon encourages trade, they encourage various cultures, and they welcome that. So they were a land of merchants. So it talks there about, in verse 24 that we read, chapter 24 in 2 Kings, it talks there about he not only brought the nobility and the king into exile with him, but a lot of Israel's skilled workers and artisans. They were brought as well because they were going to probably be commissioned to build something for him as well. And those skills would really come in handy for that as well. All right, let's have a look at verse 5. He also took from the seed of the land and planted it in fertile soil, a meadow beside abundant waters. He set it like a willow. All right. So in reference to the seed that they're talking about, the seed of the land. So what he's talking about is he gets Zedekiah, and that wasn't his name. I can't remember what his name was, but he was renamed to Zedekiah, Babylon renamed to Zedekiah. He was appointed as the interim king, if you like, of Judah. And so this is what is symbolized here when it talks about putting him in fertile soil. It means he gives him freedom, he gives him autonomy, he leaves him in Jerusalem, and he doesn't take away or strip everything away. He leaves him with something to work with, and he plants him there. So this is now something that Babylon has planted because they were the ones to put him in power. They chose him. I think he was related to Jehoiachin. I think it was his uncle or something like that, yeah. a close relation. So he made this agreement with Zedekiah, and we see that in verse 13 of Ezekiel chapter 17. And he took one of the royal family and made a covenant with him, putting him under oath. He also took away the mighty of the land. So took away quite a bit, but left a lot for Zedekiah to be able to run and rule autonomously to a certain extent in his way. All right, and so that fertile soil, when we talk about fertile soil, there's a reference in Deuteronomy chapter 11, we won't go there now, that talks about, I don't have a map here to show you, but when we talk about the east coast, or was that the west coast of Israel, is like a fertile crescent that goes up in a crescent shape, and it joins up with another fertile strip, which is what goes along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, going down to Babylon. So there's this whole crescent kind of a shape there. So when we talk about a fertile area, that not only includes Babylon, but includes that area that represents Israel and Judah. It was also fertile. All right, so that's where he planted him. That's where he put him in power, Zedekiah. And the idea was to be subservient, if you like, to a certain extent to Babylon. Set it like a willow. A willow is normally something I think they plant along the river banks, I think is a normal place that you plant a willow, and kind of like symbolizing this fertile crescent where it's planted. And he allows Zedekiah to grow and thrive in his own way, autonomously. Any questions so far? All right, let's have a look at verse 6. Then it sprouted and became a low spreading vine with its branches turned towards him. The him here is referring to Nebuchadnezzar. But its roots remained under it, so that it became a vine and produced shoots and sent out branches. There's a lot of symbolism going in here. And perhaps we should read verse 14 to have a look at the parallel or the meaning. Verse 14, that the kingdom might be in subjection, not exalting itself, but keeping his covenant, that it might continue. All right, so we're talking about the idea of being a low spreading vine. So it's not a massive tree of the forest, powerful, but a low growing tree like a vine. So it's not exalted, it's cut down to size a bit, but given the ability to grow. Obviously, as a kingdom that's taking over the world, you don't want to leave the countries that you take over in any kind of position of strength. Otherwise, that will count against you. And so you would take away some of the key people from there. You do whatever you can to reduce it in its power. And so that's why it's this low spreading vine tree. And this is not the first time, obviously, that Israel has been compared to a vine. We see that in chapter 15 as well, where it compares them to a vine. And a vine in the forest of big trees. So yeah, there's this idea of a vine coming across there again. So low spreading means humbled, but still allowed to continue in their own way. Now it talks there about branches turned towards him. So that's turned towards Babylon, and as described in verse 14 there, it's talking about this covenant agreement that Israel has with Babylon now to pay tribute. Then it talks here about its roots remained under it. So these roots are in reference to their autonomy. They are allowed to grow themselves from their own efforts, from their living off the fat of the land in their own way. But their branches, so their roots can grow wherever they need to grow to get the nutrients, but their branches need to point towards Babylon. In other words, be subservient, serving, reaching out to them and serving them in this way. So that's the idea of the shoots and the branches. And I suppose we can draw a very similar parallel to what we know about a vine and how it grows as well. I was doing some digging around my vine the other day. I was putting a post down. It's unbelievable how far those roots go. It's quite crazy. You go there and you have a look. Just a little vine. It's about that fat, right, stem there. And you go and have a look 5-10 meters away. There's this root coming up. What tree is this? Oh, it's the vine. It grows a long way and it sucks nutrients from a wide area. And those shoots are allowed to grow. They've been given their autonomy. So that's verse 6. Now we're going to have a look at this expanded even more. I think we're going to have a look a bit more. Now that's pretty much summing up the idea of the first eagle that we've been talking about, and that is Babylon. So now we're going to talk about another eagle, and there'll be obviously a lot of similarities between these two eagles, but they are different. They are different eagles. But there was another great eagle with great wings and much plumage, and behold, this vine turned its roots towards him and sent its branches towards him from the beds where it was planted, so that he might water it. All right, so now this is now in reference to what happened to Jerusalem when they were going along nicely, given their own autonomy, serving Babylon. That wasn't good enough for them. They didn't like that arrangement. They didn't like to pay tribute to this great eagle. And so this is where they rebelled. And now we're going to see how they now try to serve or attempt to serve another eagle in order to make an agreement with them, to break their agreement with Babylon. So it gets rather complicated. And we're talking about Jerusalem, a nation that is often known to flirt with other nations and make agreements with them and change alliances. I suppose all the kingdoms of the world were pretty much like that at the time. All right, so now we have this other great eagle, and let's have a look at verse 15 that shows us the translation, if you like. But he rebelled against him, that's against Nebuchadnezzar, by sending his envoys to Egypt, that they might give him horses and many troops. Will he succeed? Will he who does such things escape? Can he indeed break the covenant, that's the covenant with Babylon, and escape? So interesting. This is a move, a political, strategical move that Israel has made in order to reach out towards Egypt. So it talks there about turning its roots towards him. Now what is the purpose of the roots? The purpose of the roots is to get nutrients from the soil so that they can grow. And this is exactly what they wanted and needed from Egypt. What does it talks about? He wanted their horses and their troops. They wanted help in some way. So they wanted these nutrients that they needed in order to break this agreement they had with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I suppose these kinds of agreements are very, very tricky agreements to have, because the nation that you're serving and the nation that you're trying to get as an ally, there's this kind of like where the one will compare themselves to the other and think, is this the right thing to do to help Israel in this context, to help them break away from the yoke of Babylon that Babylon has put on them? They're kind of like weighing themselves up to see, is it a good idea to do this? But Israel is now making or reaching out, literally and figuratively, reaching out to Egypt for support. So it turns its roots towards them, and it talks about sending these messengers to Egypt to ask for help. Of course, we know that Egypt is one of those kingdoms that's been pretty much off-center from the center of the world. If you think of Israel as the center of the world, which it pretty much is in terms of geographically speaking, Egypt is kind of like decentralized. And so its history is very different to other countries. It's not a country that gets taken over by other countries often. So it pretty much, remains autonomous throughout its entire history. There have been times, especially, talking about Roman and Greek times, yes, where Egypt was taken over in part or in whole, but it pretty much keeps it to itself. So it's a good analogy to call it a great eagle as well, because it's been there. It is the oldest kingdom, if you like, of that time, or of the historical world. And so it's also a great eagle. And so there is a history, of course, that Israel shares with Egypt, and that history is obviously related to how a lot of the whole nation of Israel comes from Egypt, don't they? From the land of Goshen. So there is that kind of like a loose relationship that they have. So asking Egypt for help is kind of like a natural outcome. Then it also talks about turning its branches towards him. So here we have the roots are for support and the branches are for service. Just like the branches were pointing towards Babylon, to serve them, what grows on the branches? Fruit. And that fruit you give to the person you serve. So now it's doing the same thing. Now it's moving its branches, not pointing to Babylon, but pointing more towards the south, towards Egypt, and saying, here's some fruit. If you help me out, I will give you these rewards. Jerusalem was a wealthy place. Solomon had made it very wealthy, and so it still had some of that wealth. All right, so that's a new promise, or a new covenant they were trying to make with Egypt. It talks there, so that he might water it in verse 15. And he asked them for that help, and we saw that before, the horses and the troops. So, and verse 15 talks about that very key word, rebelled. So, as we, I think this is all we can do today, but as we look a bit further on, I know we talk about this covenant that Israel has with Babylon. But as time goes by, we see how this actually just symbolizes a covenant that God has, that Israel has with God by extension. And we'll have a look at that next week as it unfolds. The dynamics and the complexity of this parable will unfold. So I think that's all we have time for today, and we'll take it up from verse 8 next Sunday.